Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to begin the afternoon session. The first speaker is Keith BENSUSAN. Dr. Keith BENSUSAN has been working at the Gibraltar Botanic Gardens since 2007 and became its director in 2011. He's also General Secretary of the Gibraltar Ornithological and Natural History Society. His background is in the biological sciences and he has a broad knowledge of terrestrial natural history, most notably plants, insects and birds. His PhD, which he obtained from the University of Leeds, is in avian ecology. Keith.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk to you about 30 years of bird ringing in Gibraltar, not because bird ringing has only taken place in Gibraltar over the last 30 years, but because that is as long as the more or less constant effort GONHS Ringing program at Dewsgate has been taking place. And I should highlight that I'm giving this talk on behalf of both myself and my colleague Charlie Beddes. So what is bird ringing? Well, it's the placing of a small and very light metal ring on the leg of the bird, and each ring has a unique number which allows the identification of individual birds. So a variety of methods can be used to trap and ring birds, but in Gibraltar we use mainly mist nets, which are very, very fine nets, almost invisible to the birds, and you'll see some examples later. Bird ringing can be carried out by amateurs as well as scientists. In fact, it is, especially in the British tradition, it's largely amateurs who carry it out, but it does require special training. In Gibraltar, bird ringing is carried out by GONHS under the auspices of the British Trust for Ornithology, which is responsible for all bird ringing in Britain. And ringing can only be carried out locally with a license. Why bird ringing? Well, the movements of birds can be tracked at different spatial scales, from local to global. And apart from tracking movements, the ringing of birds also allows for the collection of biometric data and the study of their condition, for example, by measuring their length of their wings, the weight, fat and muscle, etc. When the same birds are retrapped, it's possible to study their life histories, to track their age and biometrics through time. Also, size of populations can be estimated via ringing and recovery. And the identity of individual birds can also allow estimation of territory, occupancy, and size. So, how do we go about ringing birds, particularly in Gibraltar? Well, we set up these mist nets. This is a net ride, although we do most of our ringing at Dewsgate. This is a net ride at Middle Hill. Those nets are unfurled, but once they're furled, you can see that the net is very fine. The birds are trapped in the net, but they're not harmed, and they're extracted from the nets with great care by trained individuals. And then a ring is placed on the leg of the bird. The ring carries a code as well as the origin of the ring, and this allows us to trace the origin of the bird easily with whatever entity is responsible for placing the ring on the bird. Birds are then processed. This is our premises at Dewsgate. Birds are processed, compared with the literature when necessary. Typically, they're weighed. Various measurements are taken. For example, the wing measurement is normally taken. Molt is studied as well, the condition of the feathers, age of the birds. And so, very briefly, a bit about the history of ornithology in Gibraltar, because ringing follows the same pattern as ornithology more generally. We know that the first serious studies of the ornithology of Gibraltar were carried out by visiting military personnel from the UK. Most prominent among these, arguably, was Howard Irby, who wrote the Ornithology of the Straits of Gibraltar in the 1800s. 2 volumes were published. Following that, and that continued to be the case throughout the early 20th century, and even up to 1970, we still had, for example, Sir Gerald Lathbury was governor of Gibraltar, and he published a paper in the journal Ibis on the birds of Gibraltar and its surrounding waters. But this already coincided with a time when locals, when Gibraltarians were becoming active in the study of ornithology in Gibraltar, and I'll highlight some of these very briefly. That's a very young Ernest Garcia presenting a program on birds on GBC TV. Publications began to be produced by a local group, originally the Gibraltar Ornithological Group, but this eventually morphed into first the Gibraltar Ornithological Society and finally the Gibraltar Ornithological and Natural History Society, GONHS. A few individuals in Gibraltar have been quite prominent in the study of birds of the region and of Iberia. Recently, I'll highlight 2. There's Clive Finlayson, of course, and that's one of his important works, The Birds of the Strait of Gibraltar. And that's Ernest Garcia, who again co-authored again an important book called The Birds of the Iberian Peninsula. And bird ringing in Gibraltar really followed the same pattern, because the first sustained ringing efforts in Gibraltar, certainly as far as I'm aware, were by this gentleman, Brian Etheridge, who was posted to Gibraltar in the early 1970s, and he was very active in bird ringing. Eventually, locals took over, so that by the end of the 1970s, already there were Gibraltarians who were ringing regularly on the rock. But it wasn't until 1991 that GONHS inherited premises on the Upper Rock. The old police guardhouse at Jewsgate became the Jewsgate Field Centre and Ringing Station, which we can see here, ideally located for this sort of activity, because it commands an excellent view of the strait and is a really great place, not just for ringing, but also to watch migration of soaring birds during the spring. That's a pre-clifftop house view, if you remember that. Photograph of a mist net again, showing how fine these nets are. There are 18 of these around the Jewsgate Field Centre, located in the very thick maquis scrub that surrounds the field centre. So again, birds are processed within the field centre, compared to each other when necessary. And what about outputs? Well, for example, in the Gibraltar Bird Reports, which is published by GONHS every year, there's a ringing report summarising ringing activities for the year. And that always includes totals not only for the year, but for the year previous to that, and also the totals since 1991, when the programme began. So there have now been 30 years of intensive bird ringing at Jewsgate from 91 to 2020, with a correspondingly rich data set. In total, there have been 9,028 days or sessions of ringing in those 30 years. 131 species of birds have been ringed in Gibraltar during that period, out of over 108,000 birds ringed. And I have to say that, importantly, we've been reliant largely on visiting ringers, mainly from the UK. We wouldn't have been able to do this without the volunteers who have been really helpful. So a brief overview of the sorts of birds that are captured at Jews Gate. Mainly passerine birds, which are the birds that we're targeting, songbirds, resident species such as, for example, the Sardinian warbler, this lovely male Sardinian warbler here. Some other resident species that we might expect, blackcaps and blackbirds, wrens, things like that, but also more unusual birds are trapped from time to time, such as this little owl. But it's mainly the migrant birds that we're targeting. We'll talk about two main groups of migrants. They are the Pre-Saharan and Trans-Saharan migrants. The first group are the migrants that are passing through Gibraltar, well, from around this period, mid-October onwards through to November. And they're the birds that migrate from northern Europe to spend the winter around the Mediterranean. These include a lot of finches, such as goldfinches, for example. Also scarcer species, this siskin, again a northern European bird that comes, the numbers tend to fluctuate from year to year. This is a ring-ouzel, a close relative of the blackbird that's found in alpine habitats. And then there are the Trans-Saharan migrants. The migrants that migrate all the way from Europe to sub-Saharan Africa, which are the sort of the classic migrations of birds that people imagine. Again, a brief overview of the sorts of species involved. We have species such as this lovely subalpine warbler here, a species that breeds mainly in the Mediterranean, in fact the Western Mediterranean now. Another one here is the Western Orphean warbler, again a primarily Western Mediterranean species. Hirundines occasionally, not very frequently, but this is a red-rumped swallow. Also species from further north in Europe, of course. In fact, they make up the great majority of the catchers. This is a male pied flycatcher. Somewhat more spectacular is this lovely male golden oriole. Not just passerines, but also near passerines tend to be trapped. So this is a very beautiful hoopoe. These are our European bee-eaters. And very rarely we might capture things such as great spotted cuckoo. Wryneck, really interesting migrant bird, which is actually a type of woodpecker. I say trans-Saharan with a question mark there because, I mean, are the birds that come through Gibraltar primarily trans-Saharan migrants? Most of the European wrynecks spend their winter south of the Sahara, but some of them don't. Some of them winter around in southern Iberia in particular, and in Morocco. And in fact, there is evidence from birds captured in Gibraltar by studying their FAT scores. It looks like the birds that arrive in Gibraltar, or many of them at least, are either at the end of their journeys or close to the end of their journeys. Some surprises too. Kingfishers have been captured at Jews Gate on 4 different occasions. What on earth are they doing up the rock? Scarce migrants too, things such as this bullfinch, which typically winter slightly further north. They don't really reach these latitudes every year, although they are found during the winter in mountains nearby. Other scarce migrants, sort of borderline vagrants, include birds such as this icterine warbler, which it is a European species, but it uses mainly the eastern flyway. I know that Clive is going to talk to you about flyways later. It's a bird that breeds in Central and Eastern Europe and in Western Asia, and spends the winter in southern Africa. We do occasionally get them migrating through Gibraltar. And then the true vagrants, some birds that turn up are truly remarkable. This is a a little bunting, a largely Asiatic bird, but one which does range into Scandinavia. As you can see from that map, they winter mainly in East Asia, but some of them make their way into Europe every year. Another largely Asian bird that turns up in Europe, and in fact which has been turning up in this region in greater numbers in recent years, is the yellow-browed warbler, this tiny little Philoscopus warbler, which incredibly makes a journey all the way from Siberia to this part of the world. More unusual still, an indigo bunting, which is an American bird, must have been blown across the Atlantic and somehow found its way to Gibraltar. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the journeys that some of the birds that are trapped in Gibraltar undertake. And first of all, we're going to have a look at some terminology. So if we refer to a bird as a retrap, we're referring to a bird that is ringed and subsequently trapped at the same site, whereas a control is a bird that's trapped at the study site but was originally ringed at a different site. And a recovery was originally ringed at your site but trapped at a different site. And this is a summary of recoveries and controls of birds that have been trapped in Gibraltar. So we can see I'm not going to say an even spread across Europe, but we can see that birds have occurred throughout Western Europe, and some of those clusters may be related to trapping efforts in different parts of Europe, but we'll talk a bit more about that later. And in total, we're talking about 125 recoveries and 252 controls. Let's remember that that's out of 108,000 birds that have been processed. We look at the journeys undertaken by resident species, then, for example, Sardinian warblers, which are a very common resident species in Gibraltar, as most of us will know. 6,547 of these birds have been processed at Jewsgate since 1991. Only 5 have been recovered or controlled. That's 0.08% of birds processed, and you can see there in that map that they haven't gone very far at all, those birds. In fact, the furthest record is from Ceuta, just across the strait. And if we look at the global distribution of the species, you can see that it's found throughout the Mediterranean and North Africa, and that just shows how little the Gibraltarian birds travel. Not the case with all populations. Some are slightly migratory, as you can tell from that map. Okay, we can also learn about longevity of birds from ringing data. So, for example, although the numbers are greatly augmented by migrant birds, Eurasian blackcaps are resident in the maquis around Jewsgate. And the average lifespan of a blackcap we know is about 2 years, although of course this is partly due to the high rate of mortality among young birds. But even then, a blackcap that was first captured at Jewsgate on the 18th of September 2012 was captured again in October 2012 and February 2013. So after evading capture for 7 years, it was recaptured on the 24th of February 2020, almost 8 years after it was first captured. And the record for blackcaps is actually of a bird that was almost 14 years old from the Czech Republic, so our bird was really quite old. Further to that, a Sardinian warbler was captured on the same date that was ringed over 5 years earlier, and the maximum lifespan of the species is recorded at just over 8 years, so we can use ringing to track the lifespans of these birds. We talk a lot about the importance of Gibraltar to migrating birds. Obviously, there is no doubt that the Strait of Gibraltar is a bottleneck. It's a very short crossing for migrants, but is it important beyond that? Is Gibraltar a stopover site, as people sometimes assume? I believe, again, I think Clive is going to talk to you further about this, but a bit of preliminary data here that might flavour the discussion later. This is a willow warbler, one of the most common migrants in Europe. So 31 to 60 million breeding pairs of these in Europe, of which we have processed 6,399 birds. And bear in mind that this is our most numerous Trans-Saharan migrant. Of these birds, only 15 have been recovered or controlled. You can see there that they're from the UK, the Netherlands, and also Scandinavia. Scandinavia has an enormous breeding population of willow warblers, so we shouldn't be surprised that there are willow warblers recovered from Scandinavia. That constitutes 0.23% of birds processed, not very many at all, and they don't seem to hang around much around Dewsgate either. And as an example, we can look at a related species. This is a Western Bonelli's warbler, and a few years ago with some Polish and Israeli colleagues, we compared this species and its eastern counterpart, the Eastern Bonelli's warbler, migrating through Gibraltar and Eilat in Israel. And one of the things that we found was that throughout the study period, we retrapped 1.6% of Western Bonelli's warblers in Gibraltar compared to 20.2% of Eastern Bonelli's warblers in Israel. And the probability of recapture at Gibraltar was extremely low, much lower than at Eilat. So again, these birds at least aren't using Gibraltar as a stopover site. Forget between years, not even within years. They're not hanging around at all. But those are the Trans-Saharan migrants. Can we say the same about the Pre-Saharan migrants, the birds that winter in the Mediterranean? After all, they're very close to their wintering grounds. Some of them might be wintering in Gibraltar as well. There are lots of resources for these birds in the autumn. A lot of the shrubs in the maquis are now in fruit, and these birds exploit that fruit. So let's look at a few examples, a few of the most common species that are trapped, the most numerous. The European robin, for example, which has a distribution that's largely restricted to Europe. Again, 33 to 68 million breeding pairs in Europe, so a very numerous bird in Europe, of which 14,379 birds were processed. So even though there are comparable numbers of robins to willow warblers, we're catching a lot more robins than we are willow warblers, but only 24 recovered or controlled, which constitutes 0.17% of 0.17% of birds processed. Again, those birds distributed throughout Europe. Black redstart, another extremely common pre-Saharan migrant. Slightly more extensive distribution with two sort of nuclei, one in Europe and one in sort of Central and East Asia. Not as numerous as robins, 6 to 10 million breeding pairs, but nevertheless 8,500 birds processed in Gibraltar. You can see that many of the birds that we capture here are French. France has an enormous population of black redstart, so again, that shouldn't surprise us. 26 of them recovered or controlled, which is 0.31 birds processed. Perhaps a slightly different pattern from blackcaps. As I said, blackcaps are resident in Gibraltar in the Maquis, but they're greatly outnumbered by the birds that arrive during the autumn and winter from Central and Northern Europe to spend the winter largely in the Mediterranean region, although some of them reach West and East Africa. So that's their distribution there. And this is a quite different map to the ones that we've seen so far. So 25 to 49 million breeding pairs, but by far the bird that we capture the most at Jews Gate, almost 35,000 birds processed during those 30 years, of which 299 have been recovered or controlled, which is almost 1% of birds processed. That's a fairly high return rate. And they're more regularly controlled or recovered than the other species. That's one interesting point. The other interesting point is that a huge proportion of the birds that we catch in Gibraltar are from either the southern UK or the Low Countries. So there seems to be a pattern there that we're not seeing in the other species. Says technological advances there, but it should read migration of nocturnal species. So one of the things that we can do with ringing as well, we can learn a lot more about the migration of nocturnal species, such as this European nightjar captured at Jews Gate, a bird that we rarely observe during the day, of course, because they're strictly nocturnal, but as we outlined in this little note in the Gibraltar Bird Report on the migration phenology of 3 nocturnal bird species at Gibraltar, because of the ringing efforts and also because of trapping efforts at night, we've been able to learn a lot more about the migration of these nocturnal species than we knew about before that. And as an example, those are 5 European scaup owls captured at Jews Gate, and you would never have a visual observation of 5 scaup owls in Gibraltar. They're observed very rarely. And finally, the phenology of the 3 species that we studied. Okay, so as I said earlier, the birds that we are focusing on, that our efforts are focused on, are the migrant birds. And you can see there that they greatly outnumber residents, which make up only about 13% of all birds trapped at Jews Gate. I've included a category there saying mainly migrant because, of course, blackcaps can be either migrant or resident, but in fact, the overwhelming majority of those 37%, mainly migratory species, are migrating blackcaps. We can look at habitat selection as well of birds trapped and ringed at Jews Gate. So we can see that the vast majority of the species captured are species that live in wooded habitats or wooded and open habitats. Birds that are restricted to open habitats comprise only 1.5% of all birds captured, whereas a lot of these species are quite numerous in Europe. You'd expect a lot more of them unless the birds were selecting the habitats. And we can make a comparison because together with Moroccan colleagues, we ran a ringing campaign in the Smir marshes in northern Morocco, and Smir is only 45 kilometers south of Gibraltar, but it consists of a very different habitat. It's marshland. And we can see here that wetland species, which are negligible in Gibraltar, comprise 14% of species in Smir, and that shows that wetland species are selecting wetlands. Even though they migrate at night, they're very good at finding habitats. Migratory strategies as well, if we compare the two migrant groups, Trans-Saharan migrants comprise almost 21%, so basically most of the birds that we trap at Jews Gate tend to be these pre-Saharan migrants that spend the winter in the Mediterranean. If we compare that to, again, the Smir marshes in Morocco, we can see that if we combine transit migrant and breeding migrant together, which would make up the Trans-Saharan migrants, then they comprise the majority compared to wintering migrants. So why is that? Is that indeed because, as we highlighted earlier, the upper rock is covered in this thick maquis with all the fruiting shrubs that could attract these birds that rely on fruit, or could it be another factor? Well, as all those of us who are birders in Gibraltar will know, conditions in Gibraltar for migrants are best during days like these, when it's cloudy, when you've had rain overnight, and when the birds have been essentially forced to stop in Gibraltar. They're not choosing to stop here, they're forced to stop here by adverse weather. And if we look at this graph, which shows rain in Gibraltar, and we take rain as an indication of cloud cover, then obviously you've got more cloud cover during February and March and October, November, which coincides with the migratory period for these pre-Saharan migrants, and that's probably why we're capturing a lot more of these pre-Saharan migrants. Okay, so there's the ringing at Jews Gate, but there are other ringing opportunities in Gibraltar as well. We have a very large colony of yellow-legged gulls, for example, and we've been ringing those as well over the year, mainly as pullets, as chicks, and as you can see from that photograph, fitting them with colour rings, blue rings with a white code on them, which is visible not just when the birds are captured, but also in the field. So it's a better method, really, if you want observers in the field to be able to report back. And we've had quite a number of such observations. You can see there that because yellow-legged gulls, thousands breed on the rock, but the majority disperse after the breeding season. The ringing campaign has taken place mainly during the 90s and 2000s, and you can see that most of our birds, even though they leave Gibraltar during the autumn, don't go very far. Most of the sightings are from southern Spain and southern Portugal, but there are some sightings from southwest Morocco, and interestingly, a single sighting of a bird that was seen in December in a refuse tip outside of Paris. Refuse tips being the favorite habitat of this species. More ringing opportunities come from the many raptors that are downed mainly during the spring migration period, when they're harassed by the very aggressive breeding gulls, and also the peregrine falcons. And as most of you will know, GONHS has a very active bird avian rescue team. So the raptor rehabilitation team takes custody of these birds, rehabilitates them, and releases them again. A lot of short-toed eagles, the bird that we saw earlier, but this is a honey buzzard, and of course these birds are ringed when they're released. But it's not just ringing that takes place, because there are alternatives to bird ringing as well. These are plastic wing tags. comparable, if you like, to those colour rings that we saw earlier, and these are fitted onto the wings of birds, and they make it very easy to be able to observe and report these birds, and indeed we've had some success, notably griffon vultures, which have been fitted with these and which have been reported to us from northern Spain. So here are a couple of examples. You can see there the griffon vulture in flight with KH on its wings very, very clearly. Also this short-toed eagle. We have had visual reports of short-toed eagles that have been wing tagged as well. So we'll talk a bit about the future for bird ringing, and we can start by asking ourselves what bird ringing can tell us about bird migration. Well, first of all, if you're lucky enough to capture the birds, and we've seen the numbers earlier, but if you're lucky enough to recapture the birds, then you might know the distance between the 2 points where a bird has been captured. You might be able to learn about the condition of birds at each point, the time that has elapsed between the 2 captures, whether birds use sites faithfully, but this relies on the rate of recapture, which, as we have seen, can be extremely low. And so, as an example, if we look at this map of recaptures and controls of blackcaps trapped in Gibraltar, and you can see that spread of records throughout Europe, but as I said, with clusters in the Low Countries and in the UK. And we can draw straight lines between each of those points, but does that reflect the journey that each of those birds has taken? Surely not. And it's technological advances that have been shedding light on these phenomena, and from which we have learned a lot more in recent years about the phenomenon of bird migration. I've included a photograph of a cuckoo here because it's from common cuckoos as well as other species that we've been learning a lot about bird migration, and I'm going to give you some examples of the excellent work that is being done by satellite. So there's this paper, for example, which is about narrow front loop migration in a population of common cuckoos, as revealed by satellite telemetry. And you can see from that illustration, from that figure in that paper, that we can learn a lot more about the route that a bird takes from satellite work than we ever could from ringing. Furthermore, those are the routes taken by many individual birds on their way south and then back north, and that is data at a resolution that was unimaginable only a couple of decades ago. And it's not just migratory routes. We can learn about conservation issues. This paper, interestingly, highlights that population decline is linked to migration route in the common cuckoo. So the individuals are affected differentially according to the route, to the migratory route that they take. And again, we can see the wealth, the richness of data that is generated with new technology. We can learn too about the migration of nocturnal species, such as this common nightjar, as I said earlier, very rarely observed in the field because they're strictly nocturnal, but once they're fitted with these trackers, there you go, those are the routes that the nightjars are taking. We know where they're migrating, when they're doing so, where they're wintering, in Africa, data that are very poorly known. But of course, it's not only migration that we can learn about using these technological advances. These are two very closely related shearwaters, indeed considered the same species by some people, but that's the Scopely's shearwater to your left, the Mediterranean species, and its Atlantic counterpart, the Corrie's shearwater on the right. Very, very similar species, but as we will see with different habits and ecologies. It was thought initially that the Scopely's shearwater only bred in the Mediterranean and Corrie's shearwater only bred in the Atlantic, but people eventually realized that some Corrie's shearwaters were breeding in the westernmost Mediterranean, and a few Scopely's shearwaters were breeding in the Atlantic as well. And so one of these examples is a mixed breeding population in the Chafarinas Islands, which are off the coast of Morocco, but are Spanish. And there you get the two species breeding. And you can see from the figure above, those are the feeding areas of the Corrie's shearwater, the slightly larger Atlantic species. And then below we have the feeding area of the Scopely's shearwater, the Mediterranean subspecies. And as you can see there, the Mediterranean birds feed almost exclusively around the islands where they nest, whereas the Atlantic species or subspecies will forage all the way to Portugal, even if they're breeding in the Chafarinas Islands. And these differences in foraging site could be partly driven by traditional feeding grounds of the founder population of Corrie's shearwaters, but I think that the differences in distance and access to the Atlantic is more likely driven by the larger size and wing loading of Corrie's shearwaters and the fact that they can be more mobile as a result. And if we're wondering why these Corrie's shearwaters are in the westernmost Mediterranean when they're an Atlantic species, well, that's a map of salinity in this part of the Mediterranean, and we can see that the Alboran Sea, and certainly the Strait of Gibraltar, is in many ways more similar to the Atlantic than it is to the Mediterranean. So ecologically, they're in the Atlantic really still and not the Mediterranean. Further discussion on the future for bird ringing. So if we look at the number of birds ringed in Gibraltar, which we already said was over 108,000 birds, that's a non-trivial figure. 125 of those were recovered elsewhere. That's a 0.115% recovery rate, or 1 for every 1,870 birds ringed. You've got to get through a lot of birds in order to have recoveries. We assume that the technology is a lot more expensive, but actually if we look at A-sized rings, which are one of the smallest of the ring sizes and therefore one of the cheapest, we currently pay £130 for 500 rings. And this works out to about £484 per bird controlled, whereas the smallest GPS data logger that is currently on the market costs £295 per unit, and the smallest geolocator, a technology that has less resolution than the GPS data loggers, but is still a lot more useful in such studies than ringing. That costs £135 per unit. So, of course, there are plenty of other considerations too, but we really have to ask ourselves whether ringing is more cost-effective when it comes to migration studies. I'll give you some local examples of the deployment of such technology. So this is a short-toed eagle that was fitted with a transmitter in joint work by the Department of the Environment and GONHS. This is a map showing the journeys undertaken by an Egyptian vulture, again, joint work by the Department of the Environment and GONHS. And I'm going to show you a really interesting little video prepared, some excellent work here done by Carl Neto from the Department of the Environment, and that shows the journeys of two griffon vultures that were satellite tagged in Gibraltar. And you can see they spent a long time in Iberia, but eventually they make their way down to West Africa. They meet at one point. Moving about in a very small area in Senegambia during the winter. And eventually they start moving up towards Gibraltar again, but we'll move on. Another case study, this is work on pallid swifts, carried out via joint work at the University of Gibraltar, the Gibraltar Museum, GONHS, the Gibraltar Botanic Gardens. Most of us are in this room. So birds nesting at the Gibraltar Museum have been fitted with GPS trackers. Adults return to their nest after a year, allowing the retrieval of data. So swifts are very, very faithful to their nesting sites, and that makes them very useful for such work. In some cases, we've had multiple returns over the years. An example of the bird being fitted with a device. And that's a bird with its little backpack, which it takes all the way to Africa and back. Fitted expertly by Jerry and Rian, who are the experts in the team for that aspect of the work. And so that has already allowed us to retrieve information on foraging areas of pallid swifts nesting in Gibraltar. Also exciting preliminary data on migration strategy and wintering grounds. And we've repeated the exercise in 2020 with common swifts to see how they compare to this very closely related species, the pallid swift. And that's an example of part of the journeys that these pallid swifts undertake. It must be said very quickly. So, technological advances offer information at a resolution and richness that can't be matched by bird ringing, and the technology continues to improve, and it's becoming cheaper, and it's catering for increasingly small study subjects. As a result, the use of technology is becoming increasingly common and widespread, and therefore we have to ask, is there a future at all for bird ringing? Well, I would argue that there is, but with some caveats, and the authors of this paper, The Value of Ringing for Bird Conservation, clearly think that there's a future for bird ringing, but they highlight, I'm not sure whether you can read that, but they highlight that the value to bird conservation is typically higher where a ringing study is well designed and targeted to answer specific questions of relevance to conservation. And I think that is an extremely important point to make, that the value of ringing is maximized when it's carried out within the framework of carefully planned scientific research. As an example of this, I'll use another case study to finish off the talk. This is a study that we're currently carrying out on crag martins that winter at the World Heritage Site. They, as we've already heard, and indeed we will hear again, they winter in the caves on the eastern side of the rock, a beautiful little swallow. And we've been studying these since 2016, but we're not the first to, because Brian Etheridge and Norman Elkins carried out some studies during the 1970s, and then the Finlaysons were ringing them by the late 70s as well at the same site. But we revisited the site after many years without working on them. So we resumed our activities at 3 of the caves at the Gorham's complex, which are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We've been collecting data, trapping and ringing since 2016, with over 1,200 birds processed so far, so that's a lot of data. And there was particularly intense data collection during last year's season, complemented by weekly counts. And there you have one of the crag martins that we ringed last year, wearing its jewellery. What have we found? Well, in spite of what we had thought, there has not been a decrease in the population size since the 1970s. It was widely assumed that the numbers that Elkins and Etheridge were recording at that time were no longer present in Gibraltar, but it turns out that that's not true, with over 3,000 birds present in some instances. We've also found a very high level of fidelity to caves, so birds choose their caves carefully and sleep in the same cave every night. Also differences in condition of birds between caves, which means that there are better and worse caves to spend the night in. Finally, just an example of a graph from that study showing data from the 3 caves, and that's just to show that such studies are only possible with very large data sets by trapping, ringing, and measuring hundreds of birds, and there is clearly still value in ringing in that sense, that you can trap, ring, measure, and remeasure lots of birds. So some concluding remarks then. Technological advances have obviously, as we've seen, reduced the capacity for ringing as a useful method in some branches of science, and certainly for migration studies, satellite and GPS tracking is now, I would say, the only realistic method for cutting-edge research. With the advent of such technology, it has to be said that the trapping and handling of large numbers of birds becomes harder to justify on ethical grounds, because whether we like it or not, we are bothering the birds by trapping and ringing them. However, ringing retains its value in studies that rely on large data sets and repeated handling and measuring of individuals. And ringing is at its most valuable when used to test carefully framed scientific hypotheses. Ringers, even amateurs, must be disciplined participants in science. And when this is the case, ringing becomes an excellent example of the way that natural history and science can combine, and most of all, a very good example of how amateurs can contribute meaningfully to scientific studies. And finally, I will say that there is much that can yet be done with a now enormous data set that has been generated from ringing activities in Gibraltar. So, acknowledgements, and an enormous thank you especially to all of the many ringers who have volunteered to participate in our program, and they are all of those people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very interesting, informative lecture. There's one question that's come in from YouTube, and then I'll open the questions to the floor. We have 6 minutes. The question is from Tom Finlayson, who asks, why do you think there is a shortage of local ringers in Gibraltar?
I would say because of the same reason. I mean, there are fewer naturalists generally in Gibraltar than there used to be. So the same factors that affect that are true for ringing, are true for any aspect of natural history. Why are there fewer entomologists? Why are there fewer birders in general? There used to be a lot of birders in Gibraltar in the 1970s and 80s. Very few active birders, and I have to distinguish there between true birders and people who are out primarily photographing birds. So I think it's an issue that it's a problem that is afflicting natural history more generally, and not only ringing, but it's a problem for sure.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the floor? Clive Finlayson, question at the front.
To the comment of Keith, ringing, the training process that and I can tell you from experience, it's not a casual thing you can do. It requires a lot of commitment and a lot of effort, and I don't think you have to have people prepared to suffer.
Yeah.
A lot of hard graft, get up extremely early in the dark in the mornings, go to bed very late, and put in a lot of hours and get properly trained. And perhaps nowadays not that many people are prepared to do that.
Mm. Yeah.
Any further questions from the floor? I have a question, just out of curiosity, Keith. What is the main, well, not pleasure, but when you ring, I mean, I've only ever watched on occasion when we've gone to GONHS, the time I went to GONHS, for example. But what I did notice and pick up was that it seemed to be quite an exciting thing to be doing. And I know Charlie as well at Jews Gate and so on. Does it give people that ring a bit of a buzz when they collect these birds and then collect the data and so on?
I would say that again, with natural history generally, I would say that part of the appeal is that it awakens the sort of the hunter instinct in us, doesn't it? So it gets our adrenaline flowing.
That's interesting.
And I think that might be the case even more so with ringing because of proximity to the bird and the handling.
Okay, does anybody else have any comments or questions? Okay, thank you very much, Keith. Very interesting.